The most disturbing friendship turned deadly. The night has fallen. Here, fear is real and the inexplicable rules. I am Yoonjin Lee, your companion on this journey through the darkest mysteries. This channel does not bring ordinary stories. It brings echoes, scars, and truths that no one dares to tell. If you feel chills when searching for answers, you are in the right place. Turn off the light, close the door. We will face the unknown, because here, fear is only the beginning. Today, I'm bringing you one of the most disturbing friendship cases in American true crime history. A story of loyalty twisted into something unrecognizable, of two girls who knew each other better than anyone, yet somehow remained complete strangers. This is not a case about obvious villains. This is a case about how friendship can become the perfect weapon. Subscribe now and activate the notification bell. You won't want to miss what comes next. In the early 1980s, Millbrook, Vermont was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. The kind of place where children could roam freely between neighborhoods without their parents worrying too much. The winters were harsh, the summers brief, and the community was tight-knit in that peculiar way small New England towns tend to be. It was in this setting that Margaret Sullivan and Rebecca Hayes first met. Maggie was 7 years old, a shy girl with dark blonde hair and an observant nature. She had moved to Millbrook in 1982 when her father, a carpenter, took work on several restoration projects throughout the town. Becca was born and raised in Millbrook, a bright, outgoing girl with reddish hair and an infectious laugh. She was already 9 years old when Maggie arrived at Millbrook Elementary School. By all accounts, their initial connection was immediate and almost inexplicable to observers. Becca essentially adopted Maggie as her younger friend, and while the age gap might have seemed significant then, it never appeared to matter between them. Within weeks, they were inseparable. They rode bicycles together down the winding roads near Miller's Creek. They built forts in the woods behind Becca's house. They made pacts about remaining best friends forever, written on notebook paper and buried in glass jars in the backyard. Margaret's mother, Diane Sullivan, remembers the day her daughter came home excited about her new best friend. She was practically glowing, Diane has said in interviews. She talked about Becca constantly. It was as if she'd finally found her person, her other half. Diane described her daughter as naturally quiet, preferring to observe rather than participate. But with Becca, Margaret blossomed. The Hayes family seemed equally pleased with the friendship. Becca's mother, Claire Hayes, was known in town as a warm, welcoming woman who kept an open-door policy for her daughter's friends. "Our house became the gathering place," Claire has recalled. Becca and Maggie spent every afternoon here after school. They'd be in the kitchen making cookies, or in Becca's room making plans for some weekend adventure. They were good kids, really good kids. Throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, the two girls grew together through the typical milestones of childhood. They attended the same schools. They joined the same Girl Scout troop. They appeared in countless family photos, arms around each other, identical braces, identical smiles. To anyone observing from the outside, they were the picture of innocent childhood friendship. But childhood ends, and with it, something began to shift. By the time Maggie and Becca entered their teenage years, the dynamic between them had become increasingly complex. Maggie, who was 2 years younger, was developing into an attractive teenager, tall, with striking features and a quiet mystique that drew attention. Becca, conversely, was struggling with the typical insecurities of adolescence. She had developed acne. She felt that her body wasn't changing the way she wanted it to. She became self-conscious in ways that hadn't troubled her before. It was during these formative years that the first cracks in their friendship began to show. Maggie started to branch out, making other friends at school, joining different clubs and activities. Becca, for the first time in years, found herself without her constant companion. And something about that shift seemed to trigger something darker in Becca. People noticed the change, says Thomas Mitchell, who was in the same class at Millbrook Regional High School. They went from being joined at the hip to barely speaking in the hallways. And there was this tension there, like they wanted to talk to each other, but something was preventing them. It was awkward. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was definite. By 1996, 2 years before everything would fall apart, Maggie and Becca's friendship had evolved into something more complicated. They still claimed to be best friends. They still spent time together. But observers noticed a strange power dynamic had emerged. Becca seemed to need Maggie more than Maggie needed Becca, and Maggie, perhaps unconsciously, had begun to wield that dynamic to her advantage. Capítulo 2. The Deterioration. The summer of 1996 marked a turning point. Maggie had been invited to spend a week at a summer camp for academically gifted students. It was prestigious, exclusive, and it meant missing the annual tradition that Maggie and Becca had established. 2 weeks at Camp Windermere, a summer retreat on Lake Champlain, where they'd been attending since they were children. When Maggie told Becca about the academic camp opportunity, Becca's reaction was unexpectedly harsh. According to multiple accounts from friends who were present, Becca called Margaret selfish, suggesting that she was abandoning their friendship for self-interested reasons. Maggie, in response, said something that would later be remembered as a pivotal moment. Maybe I need to be around people who care about me for me, not people who need me to make them feel good about themselves. It was a cruel statement, perhaps unintentionally brutal in its accuracy, but it cut deep. Becca didn't attend Camp Windermere that summer. Instead, she spiraled into a depression that concerned even her parents. She became withdrawn, spending long hours alone in her room, emerging only for meals. She lost weight. Her grades, which had always been respectable but not exceptional, began to slip. And when Maggie returned from camp with stories of new friends and intellectual stimulation, Becca's mood only darkened further. What's particularly noteworthy is that Maggie, despite the obvious distress her best friend was experiencing, seemed to deliberately emphasize the positive aspects of her experience. She would talk loudly about her new friends within earshot of Becca. She would mention specific moments when Becca hadn't been there, in ways that seemed designed to highlight her absence. Friends noted that it was almost as though Maggie was enjoying the power dynamic, the ability to make her oldest friend jealous and insecure. By the autumn of 1996, the relationship had transformed into something that observers describe as almost toxic. Maggie held what some would call an unusual power over Becca. She could lift her mood with a kind word, or plunge her into misery with silence. She began to use this power, whether consciously or unconsciously remains unclear, to maintain control over the relationship. It was weird to watch, says Stephanie Matthews, a girl who was friends with both of them. It was like Maggie was deliberately keeping Becca on this emotional yo-yo. She'd be nice to her for a few days, then completely ignore her for a week. And Becca would be like this desperate person, trying to figure out what she'd done wrong. The situation became even more complicated when a boy entered the picture. His name was David Turner, a senior at Millbrook Regional High School who had recently moved to town. He was handsome, charming, and he caught the attention of both girls, though for different reasons. Becca, who had never had a serious boyfriend and was increasingly desperate to feel wanted and valued, became almost obsessed with David. She would contrive reasons to be where he was. She joined a club at school specifically because he was the secretary. She found excuses to talk to him, to engage him in conversation. But then Maggie got interested in him too. What happened next has been the subject of speculation and debate for decades. David Turner claims that he and Maggie began dating in the spring of 1997, more than a year before the events that would change everything. Becca, he says, was devastated. She confided in him that she had liked him, hoped that he might return her feelings. But Maggie, David claims, told him that Becca wasn't his type, and that she doubted her friend had a realistic chance with him. Whether Maggie said those exact words remains disputed, but what's certain is that David Turner began to date Maggie Sullivan, and that Becca's fragile emotional state deteriorated further. During the summer of 1997, the trio was often seen together, Maggie and David as a couple, and Becca tagging along, third wheel, watching her best friend with the boy she'd harbored feelings for. Multiple witnesses from that time describe Becca as appearing almost desperate, trying to maintain her friendship with Maggie while simultaneously trying to navigate the humiliation of unrequited feelings for David. Some friends recall moments of shocking cruelty. At one party hosted at the lake, Becca apparently tried to talk to David about a project at school, and Maggie interrupted her, saying something to the effect of, "I don't think David is interested in talking to you." The comment was said with a laugh, but witnesses described the sting in the words. By the fall of 1997, exactly 1 year before the disappearance, friends began to notice that Becca was self-harming. There were marks on her wrists, covered with bracelets. She'd become noticeably thinner. She talked openly about feeling hopeless and worthless. Her parents, alarmed, eventually got her into therapy with a local counselor named Dr. Robert Patterson. Yet somehow, despite all of this, Maggie and Becca continued to claim they were best friends. They would still be seen together in the hallways at school. They'd still have sleepovers. though friends noted these occasions were increasingly tense. It was as though they were stuck in a relationship that was neither friendship nor pure animosity, something much more complex and dangerous. If you're enjoying this disturbing true crime narrative, please hit that like button and subscribe for more unsolved mysteries. Leave a comment telling me which aspect of this case unsettles you the most. We're only halfway through this story, and the tensions are about to reach a breaking point. The 1998 school year began like any other in Millbrook, but everyone close to Maggie and Becca could sense that something was building toward a climax. The tension between the two girls had become almost palpable. They were no longer just drifting apart. They were engaged in a complex emotional game, with stakes that seemed to intensify daily. David Turner had broken up with Maggie over the summer of 1998, citing the stress of his college applications and his upcoming departure to study engineering at the University of Vermont in the fall. Maggie, by most accounts, handled the breakup with relative grace. She moved on, began dating another boy, seemed to find renewed social energy, but Becca didn't bounce back the same way. If anything, the dissolution of the Maggie-David pairing seems to have affected Becca deeply. Perhaps she saw it as an opportunity to reconnect with Maggie. Perhaps she was still processing the jealousy she'd felt. Whatever the psychological mechanism, Becca's behavior during the first months of 1998 became increasingly erratic. She would call Maggie multiple times a day. She would show up at her house unannounced. She began what some would describe as surveillance, knowing where Maggie would be, and appearing there, sometimes pretending it was coincidence, sometimes not bothering with the pretense. Friends described it as obsessive. Maggie herself, according to interviews conducted years later, said it was beginning to feel like harassment. "She wouldn't leave me alone," Maggie told an interviewer in 2004. "It was like she couldn't function without knowing where I was and what I was doing. At first I felt sorry for her, but then it started to feel invasive. I felt like I couldn't breathe." Meanwhile, Becca confided in friends, and later in her therapist, that she felt abandoned and betrayed by the only person who had ever truly understood her. She described feeling like Maggie had used her and discarded her. She talked about feeling like her life had lost all meaning. In September of 1998, Maggie made a decision. She would go to college, away from Millbrook. She'd applied to several schools out of state and had been accepted to a selective liberal arts college in Massachusetts. She would start in the fall of 1999, which meant she had one final year of high school remaining in Millbrook. When Maggie told Becca about her college acceptance, she apparently also told her that she needed some space, that their friendship had become unhealthy, and that she thought they should see less of each other during that final year. The exact wording of this conversation is disputed. No one knows precisely what was said, but what's clear is that the message was received by Becca as a devastating betrayal. From this point forward, the dynamic shifted in alarming ways. In October of 1998, barely a week after Maggie had announced her intentions to distance herself, something happened that would eventually become central to the mystery. Becca showed up at Maggie's house late one evening, apparently very upset. Maggie's mother, Diane Sullivan, describes hearing raised voices in Maggie's bedroom. Diane went upstairs and found Becca on the floor, crying, while Maggie stood by her window, refusing to look at her friend. Diane separated them, sent Becca home, and asked Maggie what had happened. Maggie refused to discuss it, saying only that Becca had become unstable and that she was seriously concerned for her safety. The very next day, Diane received a call from Claire Hayes, Becca's mother. Claire said that Becca had told her that Maggie had said something to her that had been deeply hurtful. When Diane pressed for details, Claire was vague, saying only that it had to do with Becca's mental health and that the comment had been cruel. Diane described the conversation as strained and awkward. She apologized on behalf of her daughter, but she also suggested that perhaps Becca should have better boundaries, that the intensity of the friendship had become unhealthy. Claire, according to Diane, became defensive, asserting that Maggie was the one who had changed, who had become cold-hearted and dismissive. The phone call ended cordially, but with clear tension. The two mothers, who had previously been friendly, would not speak again until after October 23rd. In the weeks following that October evening, the situation deteriorated further. Becca's behavior became increasingly desperate and erratic. She would leave notes on Maggie's car. She would try to talk to Maggie at school and be rebuffed. She began spreading rumors about Maggie, some true, some exaggerated, some entirely fabricated, in an attempt to damage her social standing. By early October of 1998, Maggie began telling friends that she was genuinely frightened of Becca. "I don't know what she might do," she apparently said to a classmate named Jessica Williams. "I feel like she's unraveling." Jessica claims that she suggested Maggie should talk to a teacher or counselor about the situation, but that Maggie was concerned about getting Becca in trouble, despite her fear. Maggie also confided in her mother. Diane Sullivan has said in interviews that she was alarmed by what her daughter described. She wanted to contact the school counselor, possibly even the police, but Maggie begged her not to. She said she didn't want to make things worse, Diane recalls. She said that if we brought in authorities, Becca would spiral completely. She wanted to just endure it until she graduated and went away to college, so Diane agreed to wait. She kept monitoring the situation, but she allowed her daughter's wishes to be respected. What none of them anticipated was that they were running out of time. October 20th, 1998, was an unremarkable Tuesday. The autumn weather in Millbrook was beginning to turn cold, with hints of the harsh winter to come. Leaves were changing color, and Halloween decorations were beginning to appear on porches throughout the small town. That evening, Margaret Sullivan was at home with her family. Her father, Robert Sullivan, had worked late and didn't arrive home until nearly 7 o'clock in the evening. Her mother, Diane, had prepared dinner, roasted chicken, vegetables, and mashed potatoes. Margaret ate with her family, then retreated to her room to do homework. Her younger brother, Thomas, who was 14 at the time, was downstairs watching television. At approximately 9:30 in the evening, Margaret received a phone call. The call was from Becca Hayes. According to Margaret's later account, Becca was upset and wanted to come over to talk. Margaret apparently told her that it wasn't a good time, that her parents were upset with her for something, and that she really needed to stay home and get her homework done. Becca, Margaret said, became increasingly insistent, eventually demanding that Margaret see her. The exact content of that phone conversation is known only to the two girls who had it. But what is clear is that Margaret eventually agreed to meet with Becca, perhaps because she was concerned about what her former best friend might do if she continued to refuse. Margaret told her mother that she was going for a walk and would be back in an hour. Diane, who had no reason to suspect anything unusual, told her daughter to bundle up, as the evening had become quite cold. Margaret put on a burgundy windbreaker and told her mother she'd be back by 11 o'clock. Margaret never came home that evening. By 11:30, Diane began to worry. It was unusual for Margaret to be late. Diane called several of Margaret's friends to ask if they knew where she was. None of them did. Diane then called the Hayes residence and spoke to Claire Hayes, asking if Margaret was there. Claire said that Becca was in her room and had been all evening. She had not gone out. Diane felt the first spike of real alarm. By midnight, Diane and Robert Sullivan called the Millbrook Police Department and reported their daughter missing. Officer James Richardson responded to their home and took down a missing persons report. Richardson would later note in his report that both Margaret's parents seemed genuinely concerned but not panicked. They assumed that their daughter might have gone to a friend's house and lost track of time, or perhaps was sitting somewhere thinking about something troubling her. A search was initiated. Within an hour, every available officer in Millbrook was driving through town, checking known gathering places for teenagers, the parking lot by the town center, the area near the lake, the woods where teenagers were known to gather. Nothing was found. By early morning on October 21st, the search had expanded. Police began knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen Margaret Sullivan. They distributed photographs. They reached out to neighboring towns, asking for assistance. Becca Hayes was questioned on the morning of October 21st, in the presence of her parents and her school counselor. Becca denied having any contact with Margaret on the evening of the 20th. When pressed, she maintained that she had been home alone in her room, reading. She denied that Margaret had called her, denied that they had planned to meet. But the Millbrook Police Department had already obtained Margaret's cell phone records. This was 1998, and while cell phones were not as ubiquitous as they would become, Margaret did have a pager and a cell phone through her father's work account. The records clearly showed a call from Becca's home phone to Margaret at 9:32 in the evening. When confronted with this evidence, Becca admitted to the call, but she maintained that Margaret had called her, not the other way around. She said that Margaret was upset about something and wanted to talk, but that she, Becca, had told Margaret that she was too tired and didn't want to discuss anything that evening. This contradicted Margaret's account, which Diane had reported to police. By the afternoon of October 21st, Margaret Sullivan had been missing for more than 24 hours. The search had expanded significantly. Volunteers from throughout Millbrook had joined police in combing through wooded areas and areas near the lake. The case was beginning to receive attention from local news media. It was during one of these search efforts that something was discovered in the woods behind Becca's house. The woods behind the Hayes residence in Millbrook were dense and difficult to navigate, particularly in the darkness that came early in October. The area had long been a place where teenagers gathered. There was an old trail that led down to a clearing where a fire pit had been built, presumably many years ago, and maintained by generations of Millbrook teenagers. On the afternoon of October 21st, a search team led by Officer Sarah Chen was sweeping through this area, calling Margaret's name, looking for any signs of disturbance or struggle. It was then that they discovered something that would become central to the case. A burgundy windbreaker, torn and muddy, lying near the trail approximately 50 yards from the Hayes residence. The windbreaker was Margaret's. It bore her name on a label inside. The discovery sent a chill through the search team. If Margaret had been wearing this jacket when she left home, then she had been in the area where the Hayes family lived. The theory that she'd simply gotten lost or gone to a friend's house began to evaporate. The area around where the jacket was found was immediately cordoned off. The Millbrook Police Department called in additional resources. A more thorough search of the surrounding area was conducted, but no other items belonging to Margaret were found. There was no body. There was no blood. There was no obvious sign of a struggle, though the muddy, overgrown nature of the area made it difficult to determine what might have happened. By evening of October 21st, the case had taken on a different character. What had begun as a missing persons investigation was now potentially a kidnapping, or worse. The police began conducting more intensive interviews with everyone who might have information. Becca Hayes was brought in for a second interview, this time at the Millbrook police station, with her parents and her lawyer present. She was now confronted with the evidence of Margaret's jacket. How did it end up in the woods behind her house if she hadn't met with Margaret? Becca's response would become one of the most disputed and analyzed statements in the case. She claimed that Margaret must have changed her mind about wanting to meet, and must have come to the woods on her own to get the jacket dirty and muddy to make it look like something had happened to her. Becca theorized that Margaret was fabricating a disappearance to get attention, or to frame Becca for something. This statement struck many investigators as implausible. Why would Margaret disappear for real if she was trying to frame Becca? It didn't make logical sense. But Becca was insistent. She maintained this story in multiple interviews over the following days and weeks, and notably, she refused to take a polygraph test, citing advice from her lawyer. Meanwhile, a full forensic analysis of Margaret's jacket was conducted. Soil samples from the jacket were compared to soil from the woods behind the Hayes residence, and they matched. But there was no blood on the jacket. There were no fibers that could be traced to another person. There were no signs of a struggle. What there was, however, was something more subtle. Forensic experts noted that the jacket appeared to have been deliberately dirtied and torn. The tears were not consistent with an accident, such as might result from Margaret falling or getting caught on a branch. They appeared to be deliberate rips, made with purpose. This finding lent credence to Becca's story, but in a different way than she intended. It suggested that someone had deliberately damaged Margaret's jacket, possibly to stage a scene or to send a message. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret Sullivan remained missing. The Millbrook Police Department, working with the Vermont State Police and the FBI, continued to investigate. Search and rescue teams combed through the woods repeatedly. Volunteers made posters and distributed them throughout Vermont and surrounding states. But Margaret was never found. Over the following months, the investigation into Margaret Sullivan's disappearance grew increasingly complex and frustrating for law enforcement. The case had several elements that pointed toward Becca Hayes as being involved, but several other elements that created reasonable doubt. The facts that seemed to implicate Becca: she had called Margaret on the evening of the disappearance. Margaret's jacket was found in the woods directly behind Becca's house. Becca's behavior in the weeks and months preceding the disappearance had been erratic and concerning. Multiple witnesses testified that Becca had expressed anger and resentment toward Margaret. Becca's account of the events of October 20th changed in several key details over the course of interviews. The facts that created doubt: there was no physical evidence linking Becca to Margaret's disappearance. No blood, no fibers, no DNA. There was no body, without remains. Proving that a crime had even occurred was difficult. Becca's parents vouched that she had been home that evening, that they had heard her moving around upstairs. Margaret's other friends testified that Margaret had been depressed and had made vague references to wanting to disappear or needing to get away. The jacket could potentially have been planted by someone else. The FBI profiler assigned to the case, a woman named Christine Wallace, was particularly skeptical of the theory that Becca was involved. In her report, which was made public years later, Wallace noted that the crime, if it was a crime, showed signs of careful planning and premeditation that seemed inconsistent with the psychology of a 19-year-old girl acting in a moment of passion or rage. If this is a homicide, Wallace wrote, then the perpetrator showed remarkable composure and planning. They removed the body completely from the scene. They left no physical evidence. They had a cover story prepared. This is not the profile of an impulsive teenager, even a deeply disturbed one. Wallace's conclusion was that while Becca Hayes could not be ruled out as a suspect, the crime showed signs of more careful planning than a crime of passion typically would. But Detective Marcus Reynolds, who was heading the Millbrook police investigation, disagreed. Reynolds believed that Becca was absolutely capable of planning something carefully, especially given how long she had been festering over the perceived wrongs Margaret had done to her. The investigators took different approaches. The FBI brought in cadaver dogs to search the woods and surrounding areas. The dogs never found a body. Search teams dredged areas of the local lakes. Nothing was recovered. Months turned into a year. Margaret Sullivan's case began to fade from the headlines, though it never entirely left the consciousness of Millbrook residents. Then, almost exactly 1 year after Margaret's disappearance, something happened that would reignite the investigation. In October of 1999, a hiker discovered a human skull in a ravine approximately 3 miles from Millbrook, in a remote area that had not been thoroughly searched during the initial investigation. The skull was brought to the Vermont Medical Examiner's office for analysis. For several weeks, investigators held their breath, hoping that the skull belonged to Margaret Sullivan, and that it might finally provide the evidence needed to move forward. But the analysis revealed that the skull belonged to a person who had been dead for many years, likely several decades. It was not Margaret. The discovery, while not relevant to Margaret's case, served as a reminder of how many mysteries the Vermont woods held and how difficult it could be to find a body, even with extensive searching. By the year 2000, Margaret Sullivan had been missing for 2 years. No body had ever been found. No definitive evidence of foul play had been discovered. Without a body, and without clear forensic evidence, prosecutors were reluctant to bring charges. Becca Hayes graduated high school in the spring of 1999, her senior year marked by suspicion and rumors that followed her everywhere. She attended community college briefly before dropping out. She seemed to isolate herself from the Millbrook community. In 2000, when she was 20 years old, Becca attempted suicide by taking an overdose of prescription pills. She was discovered by her mother, rushed to the hospital, and was saved. After her recovery, she spent time in a psychiatric facility, where she was diagnosed with depression and anxiety. Upon her release, Becca requested that the investigation into Margaret's disappearance be closed, at least as far as she was concerned. She said she was tired of the suspicion and the rumors, and wanted to move on with her life. But the police had no intention of closing the case. Now we arrive at the most disturbing aspect of this case. Not what we know, but what we don't, and what those unknowns suggest about human nature, friendship, and the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly innocent relationships. Over the past 2 decades, various theories have emerged about what happened to Margaret Sullivan on the night of October 23, 1998. And each theory raises its own set of disturbing questions. Theory 1. Becca Hayes was involved in Margaret's disappearance. Under this theory, Becca lured Margaret to the woods behind her house with the intention of harming her. Perhaps they fought. Perhaps words were exchanged. Perhaps something escalated. Becca, the theory goes, either killed Margaret herself or caused Margaret's death through some action. She then disposed of the body in a location where it has never been found, and she carefully orchestrated a story to explain away Margaret's disappearance. The disturbing part of this theory is not just that a 19-year-old girl might be capable of such an act. It's that if she is guilty, then she has successfully evaded justice for more than 2 decades. She is likely living somewhere now, perhaps married, perhaps with children, with this secret locked inside her. And the question becomes, how does a person live with that? How does a person carry that weight without it eventually crushing them or driving them to confess? Theory 2. Margaret Sullivan ran away. Under this theory, Margaret was so desperate to escape Millbrook, so desperate to get away from her life and from Becca's constant surveillance and emotional neediness, that she deliberately engineered her own disappearance. She tore her jacket to make it look like something had happened to her. Then she hitched a ride with someone or walked out of town, starting over somewhere new. The disturbing aspect of this theory is that Margaret would have allowed her parents to suffer for decades, not knowing if their daughter was alive or dead. Margaret's mother, Diane, spent years checking missing persons databases, reaching out to various police departments, holding on to hope that her daughter might contact her someday. And if Margaret is alive somewhere, living under an assumed name, she has never reached out. Her parents have never heard from her. What kind of emotional catastrophe would have to befall a person to make them capable of doing that to their own parents? Theory 3. Margaret was killed by someone other than Becca. Under this theory, Margaret did go to meet with someone that evening, but that person was not Becca. Perhaps it was another person entirely. Perhaps it was someone Margaret's parents never knew about. Perhaps it was someone Margaret met through a now-defunct online forum or chat room. Remember, this was 1998, when the internet was still relatively new and anonymous. If this theory is true, then Becca may be innocent, and the true killer has never been found. The disturbing aspect of this theory is the randomness of it. Margaret might have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She might have trusted someone she shouldn't have trusted. And by coincidence, this crime might have occurred in the woods behind Becca Hayes' house, leading to a 2-decade-long suspicion of an innocent person. But if that's true, then where is Margaret now? Who took her? And why has this person never surfaced in any other investigation? One of the most puzzling elements of the case is Margaret's jacket itself. Forensic analysis determined that the tears and the mud were deliberate. They were not consistent with an accident. Someone tore that jacket deliberately. Someone dirtied it deliberately. But why? If Becca was trying to make Margaret's disappearance look like a crime, why would she tear Margaret's jacket? Wouldn't she be more likely to leave it undamaged, making it look like Margaret had simply removed it and abandoned it? Unless the torn jacket was a message. Unless someone, whether Becca or someone else, was deliberately leaving it as a sign, intending for it to be found. But a message to whom? And what was the message supposed to convey? The phone records. Margaret's cell phone has never been found. Her pager has never been found. Both devices were missing after the evening of October 20th. This is significant because it means that there is no record of any calls Margaret might have made that evening. The last record of Margaret communicating with anyone is the call to her parents' home phone approximately 1 hour before her disappearance. Someone took Margaret's phone and her pager, presumably to prevent anyone from being able to track her movements that evening. This suggests premeditation. Whoever took these devices knew that they could be used to establish Margaret's location. But here's the disturbing question. Would a 19-year-old girl, acting in a moment of rage or passion, think to take these devices? Or does this level of planning suggest someone older, someone more sophisticated? The witness. There is one more person who may have information about the events of October 20th, 1998. Approximately 2 weeks after Margaret disappeared, a person, who wishes to remain anonymous, reported to police that they had seen 2 figures in the woods behind the Hayes residence on the evening of October 20th, sometime between 10 and 11 o'clock. The witness described seeing what appeared to be Margaret Sullivan and another figure. The witness said that they seemed to be arguing. The witness said that they were too far away to hear what was being said, and that they left the area, not wanting to intrude on what appeared to be a private matter. The witness was eventually located and interviewed by police. However, the interview was not recorded, and the witness's account has only been preserved in a written report. When asked to identify the other figure, the witness said they couldn't be certain due to the darkness and the distance, but that it might have been Becca Hayes. The witness's name and contact information were kept confidential per their request. When, years later, investigative journalists tried to track down this witness, they were unable to locate them. The person appears to have moved away from Millbrook and has not been located to this day. This is the single most important piece of evidence in the case. This witness potentially observed Margaret alive, in the woods behind Becca's house, arguing with someone. If this witness could provide a definitive identification of the other figure, it could potentially solve the case. But that witness has never been publicly identified. Some investigators believe the witness may have been a vagrant or homeless person passing through the area, and may have died in the intervening years. Others believe that the witness was someone with a personal connection to either Margaret or Becca, and that they have deliberately stayed quiet because they wanted to protect someone. 26 years have passed since Margaret Sullivan disappeared. The case remains officially unsolved. Becca Hayes, now in her mid-40s, has lived a quiet life far from Millbrook, first in Burlington, Vermont, then in various other locations. She has married, had children, and apparently tried to put the past behind her. In interviews conducted as recently as 2020, Becca has maintained her innocence. She has agreed to undergo a polygraph test, something she refused to do in 1998, and the results were inconclusive, which is not unusual for individuals who are highly anxious or have been traumatized by past investigations. The Vermont State Police has never officially closed the case, though active investigation has largely ceased. Every few years, on the anniversary of Margaret's disappearance, the case receives renewed media attention. True crime podcasts have covered it extensively. Amateur investigators on social media have proposed theories and tried to gather new evidence, but nothing has emerged that would allow law enforcement to charge anyone with a crime. Maggie Sullivan's family has never given up hope that someday, some way, the truth will emerge. Diane Sullivan, Margaret's mother, is now in her 70s and has spent more than half her life not knowing what happened to her daughter. She has been interviewed many times for various true crime productions, and she has said that the hardest part is the uncertainty, not knowing whether to hope that her daughter is alive somewhere or to accept that she is most likely dead. "Every day I wonder," Diane has said. "Every day, I wonder if I'll get a phone call, if Margaret will reach out, if someone will finally tell me what really happened that night." It's the not knowing that destroys you. It's the uncertainty. Thomas Sullivan, Margaret's younger brother, has said that the case shaped his life profoundly. He was 14 years old when his sister disappeared, at a formative moment in his adolescence. He has described the case as something that fractured his family and his community, and that he has spent his entire adult life trying to understand how such a thing could happen. The Hayes family has been similarly affected. Claire Hayes passed away in 2012, never knowing whether her daughter's childhood best friend had met a terrible fate at Becca's hands. Robert Hayes, Becca's father, has said publicly that the case nearly destroyed his marriage and his mental health. He spent years questioning whether he truly knew his daughter, whether there was some darkness in her that he had never detected. Becca herself has largely retreated from public life. She does not give interviews. She does not engage with true crime communities online. Her lawyer has instructed her not to discuss the case. In the few instances where she has been photographed by journalists, she has appeared withdrawn and haunted. The $1,000 reward that Margaret's family posted has never been claimed. No new credible information has emerged in more than a decade. As we reach the conclusion of this narrative, we must confront the reality of the Margaret Sullivan case. After more than 26 years, we are no closer to knowing what happened to her on the evening of October 20th, 1998. The case represents everything that is disturbing about the intersection of teenage psychology, friendship dynamics, and the capacity for evil or tragedy to strike without warning. If Becca Hayes was involved, then she is likely a murderer who has successfully evaded justice through careful planning and perhaps through sheer luck. She has built a life, a family, a future, on top of a terrible secret. If Margaret Sullivan ran away, then she is alive somewhere, a woman now in her mid-40s, living with the knowledge that she has caused her parents decades of suffering. If Margaret was killed by a third party, then a murderer remains at large, and the case against Becca Hayes is a tragic miscarriage of justice based on circumstantial evidence and the awkward timing of a crime that happened near her home. Or perhaps some combination of these theories is true. Perhaps Margaret ran away, was then struck by a car, or met with some accident, and died before she could contact her family. Perhaps Margaret was killed in a way that nobody has ever suspected. Perhaps there are details and facts that have never been made public, because they don't fit the narrative that authorities have constructed. What we know for certain is this: 2 girls who were best friends since childhood drifted apart. Their friendship became unhealthy, and eventually became toxic. One of them, or both of them, experienced intense emotional pain, and then one of them disappeared, and nobody has ever definitively proven what happened. The case of Margaret Sullivan remains an unsolved mystery, a reminder that evil can take many forms, and that the bonds between people, especially in youth, can transform into something dangerous and deadly. If you made it this far through this deeply disturbing narrative, I want you to think about something. How well do you really know your closest friends? What darkness might be lurking beneath the surface of a friendship that seems perfect? What capable of happening when childhood bonds become twisted and toxic? The Margaret Sullivan case reminds us that evil is not always obvious. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind familiarity. It hides behind the memory of better times. It hides in the small cruelties we inflict on people who love us. And sometimes it disappears into the night, leaving behind only questions. Subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss future explorations into true crime, mystery, and the unexplained. Leave a comment telling me, do you think Becca Hayes was involved in Margaret's disappearance? Or do you have a different theory about what happened that night? Share this video with someone who loves unsolved mysteries. Share it with someone who appreciates a well-told tale of true crime. And remember, the night has not yet ended. The fear is still real, and the truth remains, as always, just out of reach. This is Yoonjin Lee. Until next time, stay curious and stay vigilant.